Welcome, everyone, to Creating a Family. Talk about foster, adoptive, and kinship care. I'm Dawn Davenport. I am the host of this show, as well as the director of the nonprofit creatingafamily.org. Today, we're going to be talking about adoption microaggressions. What are they, and what do adoptive parents need to know about them? We will be talking with Dr. Amanda Baden. She is a professor and the doctoral program director at Montclair State University in the graduate counseling program and a licensed psychologist in private practice in Manhattan. She is an adult adoptee as well as an adoptive parent of a daughter from China. This is a re-air of a show that we did a while back. It was so good. I so respect Dr. Baden, and I hope you enjoy this show as much this time around as I did. All right, let's start with kind of just making sure we're all on the same page. What are microaggressions in general? And we don't often apply them in the area of adoption. So tell us about what they are in general, and then how do they apply to adoption?
Sure. So a man by the last name of Pierce in, I think, the 1988 first coined the term of microaggressions. And it was really applied to racial injustices, indignities, insults, invalidations around race were subtle, sometimes recognized as an expression of racism, for example. So it can be something as simple as saying something like, "Oh, you speak English really well." So that has been said to me many times in my life as an Asian woman. And I think the challenge with that is the intention sounds like it's a compliment, but it also sends these subtle messages that say, "Oh, I don't expect you to speak English well. I think you look like a foreign person to this country, so you can't really claim righteous place here." And then it can sound like, "Oh, well, the language that you speak is almost as good as what other people would speak, even though I'm quite aware that I speak English with an American accent." So regardless. And then when it comes to adoption, so there's three types of, and then Daryl Wing Su in 2007 and his colleagues, they published a paper that kind of revitalized the use of microaggressions as everyday kinds of racism that occurs in people's lives. And they identified three types: micro assaults, micro invalidations, and micro insults. And so those little subtle things that can be said, like even just saying something like, "Oh, I really don't like Chinese food. It's so greasy." That kind of suggests that, yes, there could be some extra ingredients in it that you might not like, but also it might send a message about what Chinese people are like. And so the challenge about microaggressions is they're not necessarily intentional. They can be completely unintentional and still commit a microaggression. And the other challenge about it, as a result of it being unintentional, being subtle, every one of us, myself included, commit microaggressions all the time without necessarily realizing it. And I don't really think there's a way to completely avoid it, but we can become more aware and we can keep monitoring ourselves. So when it comes to adoption, there's been a long history of stigma around adoption. So the idea of adoption as a second or third best option, or the idea of adoptees being grateful. And there's all kinds of little subtle messages that tell people who are involved in adoption in some way, so stakeholders in adoption, communicates a message of valuation of the process, of the practice, of the individuals involved. And so after Daryl Wing Su's paper came out in 2007, I first started presenting on adoption microaggressions in 2010 at the International Conference on Adoption Research. And I published my paper on it in 2016. And the paper was called "Do You Know Your Real Parents and Other Adoption Microaggressions?" Because that was an example of a kind of question, maybe said innocently, without intention to harm, without any real intentionality in terms of offending a person, but still sending a message that the real parents are the birth parents, the people who are biologically related. And adoptees all around will say that people feel pretty comfortable asking us pretty personal, intrusive questions And I think that most adoptive families can say that they've all been asked these kinds of things when people find out there's an adoption in place. Questions that you wouldn't ask about someone who was biologically related.
Mm-hmm. Where do you think some of the unconscious attitudes or stigmas towards adoption come from?
Well, I think that they are really baked into our society in a lot of ways. They're baked in the sense that we have a lot of, some countries have these strong bloodlines values about how people really should be part of a group or not. They even indicate whether you can be considered a true member of that group if you don't do or do not have that bloodline.
Mm-hmm. That's less in the U.S. though, don't you think, or not?
I religiously know. So in religious communities, for example, it can be very, very true.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, good point.
One other thing I should note is that when I wrote about adoption microaggressions, I included the micro assaults, micro invalidations, and micro insults, but I added a fourth category, and that I called microfictions.
Which I must say, I loved that you did that. Go ahead, tell us what you mean by that.
Sure. The idea behind it was when I was formulating this, I realized there's not something that really conveys the mistruths, the partial truths, the sometimes outright lies, the secrecy that is really a part of the practice of adoption for many, many decades. And so, for example, adoptees who have closed records, not being able to find out the truth of their identities and having basically, people who work for the government get to see their true identities, but the adoptees themselves did not. Mm-hmm. And many times paperwork that comes as part of the adoption has been altered by sometimes government workers, agency workers, or the state itself. So for example, as soon as a person's adopted in the US, their birth record is amended and it's the adoptive parents' information is put on their birth certificate. And so the inability, even if it's an open adoption, that still occurs. And so while the open adoption, they may still know that information, but they may not as well. And a lot of times people who were in closed record states will never get that original information. But for example, a lot of international adoptees also came with social history reports that are fabricated. I've had clients whose social history report said they were born by two young people who never married. And once they eventually find their birth families, find out they were like a fourth or fifth born daughter of an intact family. Mm-hmm. So we know there's these kinds of mistruths that come with adoption sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Before I became involved with adoption, it never occurred to me. But if you look at so many of the Disney movies,
yes,
fairy tales, but in particular Disney movies, and I've really thought about it as to it once you're aware of it, it's everywhere. The stereotypes, the myths, and I'm not sure why. I think on some level there is the needing to have parents not be in the picture because it's for the fiction of it all, having the children do more, that type of thing. I'm not sure what it is. Do you see that as well? And I mean, it seems like it feels like every Disney movie. Of course, that's not true, but it sure feels like it.
Yes, in fact, I wrote about that in the paper, and so many other stories, all the superhero stories, for example.
Yes.
There's always an orphaned person. And I think it's a narrative arc that people rely upon and have for generations. I think it's hard to watch any show without seeing that.
I agree with you. And the narrative arc is the perfect way of saying it. And there are reasons that it's a shorthand for getting rid of parents. It's a shorthand for elevating. It's just, there are reasons for it. But if I understand what you're saying, there's also a downside to that. And what is that, just in general, what would that downside be to that, to the myth or the fiction, the microfiction that is that narrative arc?
Well, I think that the way the arc goes is in two different ways. One, the orphaned child, and these are not necessarily true orphans, but created orphans, people whose parents aren't dead, but are somehow not identified in the story. So that person can overcome these difficult beginnings and be a superhero or some sort of powerful being. Harry Potter, for example, who was an orphaned person, not created, but he again became sort of like the savior of the wizarding world. And so he overcame all of his difficult beginnings. But the other way the arc can go sometimes is that the orphaned person may be seen as the damaged individual who has created all these problems. So, for example, in the Thor comics and superhero movies, Loki is the character. Loki is the damaged, orphaned child who becomes an adult who's evil in certain ways. And then, interestingly, they came up with another show that now goes into Loki's history in more depth, so that you can see the ambivalence of and the fact that there's more to his story than just being evil. But still, this narrative arc is compelling because you can make that person not have the supports that we expect, not have the even the character that you might expect from an individual.
The adoptee as damaged goods it's something I particularly am sensitive to. I remember there was quite a few years ago, we had written an article, Creating a Family Head, or published an article, we had written it about I think it was research on some of the, at least one part of it was talking about that adoptees are more represented in mental health settings, or attending, seeking out mental health, things like that. And it was just kind of a general summary of the article of some research. And an adoptee reached out to us, and I took her criticism to heart, but I don't know exactly what to do about it, but it definitely impacted. I think about it all the time. And that she was saying, it feels like you emphasize the problems, whereas the reality is most of us are not damaged goods. She goes, it makes me feel as if the emphasis on this, it casts a pall over all adoptees when most of us are dealing with no more issues than the average population. She and I entered a dialogue, and I truly appreciated that she had reached out. And like I say, it has shifted. I am cognizant, but on the other hand, as an organization that is trying to educate and wants parents to be prepared, wants to have them have realistic expectations, wants to do away that all you need to do is the myth that all you need to do is love them and everything and treat them as if they're your own, that type of thing. So it feels a little bit that I see her point, and actually after she's pointed it out, I see it everywhere. And I think she's right. But I also think that it's also true that we need to prepare parents. So anyway, that's one of when I read your article and I saw I don't know if you called it the damaged goods or the bad seed, but I think of it more as the damaged. Yes. And I think of it as damaged goods because that's the phrase she used. She said, I'm not damaged goods. And I don't know many adoptees who are. In fact, I know more people who are not adopted who are struggling, that blah, blah, blah. So anyway, any thoughts on that?
Yes, actually, I really do, because I think researchers and clinicians have had a hard time striking the right balance around this, because we want to emphasize the need for specialized care. We want to emphasize the fact that it's an underserved, understudied population, and it's also overrepresented in mental health settings. But it ignores the fact that there's people, it's still a bell curve, and there's still the sense that people who are, the idea is that there's more people doing poorly than there are people doing well, but that's not quite true. It's just it's a little shifted on the axis instead of fully one way or the other. But one of the goals of my work throughout my career has been to focus on the idea that adoptees are highly pathologized. And so from the very beginning, when I was in my doctoral program and I started studying and writing about this, I really was interested in trying to question that narrative that adoptees are damaged and that we have to decide what's functional or dysfunctional about them. And I think that we represent a whole range of functionality, just like everyone else.
Yeah.
But I want to focus on how we can help understand some of the challenges they may experience that aren't necessarily related to adjustment per se. The challenge is a lot of the research is very mixed in the findings. And so some will say adoptees are no more dysfunctional than non-adopted people. And some will say, oh, there's major differences. So we don't have a great set of circumstances, especially when we're looking at adult adoptees. There's more research on children in terms of their adjustment than there is on adults.
Yeah.
And we also know that adults tend to even out some of these things that might have been more challenging during childhood. So ultimately, I would agree that we don't want to over pathologize, but we do have to find a way to make sure that some of these services are developed, because adoptees do have different struggles. They may struggle with identity. That doesn't mean that they are have adjustment problems per se.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that they'll have more clinical issues, but they may have other racial identity issues, for example. And that those services around in terms of like therapy and other support services need to be able to address that while not minimizing or overemphasizing the import of their adoption.
It does feel like those of us I'm in more of the educating adoptive parent. You're more in the talking, from the counseling standpoint. But it does feel like it's worthy of trying to find the balance. And I think if nothing else, it's important for us to realize that there's a balance to be sought.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We are very excited to offer you now 12, count them, 12 free online courses, thanks to the support of the Jockey Being Family Foundation. If you go to bit.ly/JBF support, that's bit.ly/JBF support, you will find all 12 free online courses. It's at our creatingafamily.org online parent training center. You don't have to remember the coupon code. It's automatically applied. It takes off the $20 per course, so you get it for free. Thank you, Jockey Being Family. So what are some other common microaggression themes for adoptees?
Sure. Well, it's interesting because I've led a study with my research team at Montclair State, and we've interviewed adult adoptees, adoptive parents, and birth parents to look for the different kinds of microaggressions, both racial and adoption, that they may experience, report, or even commit themselves. And so among adoptees, some of the really common ones are things like biology is best.
Yeah, blood is thicker than water. Yeah.
Grateful adoptees, that adoptees are supposed to be grateful and therefore not angry or critical of their adoption. One that I think is pretty powerful is the cultural limbo, invalidation of heritage one, which really helps to sort of explain some of the microaggressions that transracial and international adoptees experience, where they're kind of neither white nor considered fully Black or fully Chinese or what have you, because they are seen as not really representing both the visual and the practical part of being a member of those groups.
I want to pause and talk about a couple of those. Let's start with the one you just mentioned, the cultural limbo. Some of what we hear from adoptees, and again, this is from a transracial or international, transcultural, being called slurs such as Oreo, black on the outside, white on the inside, or the slur banana, yellow on the outside, white on. I mean, the idea is that you're not fully anything.
Yes.
You don't fit. So how does that fit in with that doesn't feel micro, that kind of feels macroaggression, but nonetheless, how does that fit in with the microaggression thing?
Sure. Well, calling those names, I would agree, would probably be a macro assault, but a micro assault, I'm sorry. But then in terms of a subtler way might be going to a Chinese Student Association meeting and having everyone speaking in Chinese, and the Chinese adoptee not feeling like, when they try to interact, being sort of dismissed as not really welcome there, or not really an authentic member of the of the ethnic community.
Yeah.
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 So, I mean, I think the limbo piece, and that's why I named it that, was that adoptees do feel in a limbo space where they can't identify fully with either group because one, they feel like they might share the cultural connections with white folks, but they aren't authenticated by them or aren't acknowledged as truly feeling as truly part of the group. And similarly, they may not understand the cultural connections of their birth ethnic group, but they know people, especially as adults, look at them and expect them to know certain things that they don't.
Mhm.
And so they are constantly getting messages that say you don't belong or you're not part of.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
Let's talk some about the grateful adoptee. The idea that adoptees are not allowed to feel any of the things that everyone feels about their parents. That we may
Yes.
love them, but the truth is sometimes they're annoying, sometimes they're wrong, sometimes they're overbearing, sometimes they are just like everyone else. Everyone else's parents, and that we don't give adoptees because they're supposed to be both lucky and privileged. And but for the adoption, where would you be? That type of thing. And that message is it's not even subtle sometimes. It's just so
Not at all.
yeah. Yeah. How do adoptees in your study, how did they reflect upon that type of microaggression?
Well, I mean, so they talked about things ranging from messages where they were told that, if they hadn't been adopted, they would have been, and the story
Mhm.
goes on, right?
Yeah,
Working in a
exactly.
factory,
On the
on the
street.
streets,
Yeah.
yes, performing,
Raised in an
being a sex
orphanage. Yeah.
worker,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they've been told that not just by strangers, but sometimes by their adoptive families. And as a child, to process that information, it's pretty challenging. And the message becomes quite clear that you're supposed to be grateful and not have complaints. And so every time those messages come through, I mean, being told you would have been a sex worker is not so subtle,
No.
but but it also is one where the adoptee may feel like that it does a couple other things too. It almost sends the message that people from their birth country, that's the kind of people they become. If you're still in China or Korea or Vietnam, that's your fate. People in those countries are backwards or somehow less than white folks. And it kind of fits with another one of the microaggressions that I named cultural philanthropy, which sort of fits a bit with the grateful adoptee, but the cultural philanthropy is also about culture, that people should be grateful for being in a Western country, and everyone should want to be here because they skip the immigration challenges and they
Mhm.
get to be in these better families. And I'm putting quotes around better because
Yeah.
that often means wealthier.
And a superior culture, and I'm putting superior in air quotes as well. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Superior culture that everyone would want to be in the West if they could. And
Mhm.
it also ignores the fact that we know there's many adoptees who never got their citizenship.
Yeah.
So they still weren't protected in that way.
Mhm. The creatingafamily.org podcast, this one that you're listening to, has been around now for over 14 years, which means we have an extensive archive of shows, many of them related to today's topic of talking about racism and transracial adoption. You can begin listening now on your phone or in the car by going to your favorite podcast app. Search for our title, Creating a Family, and then follow us or subscribe, depending on what they call it. And then you can enjoy scrolling through the archive of I don't even know how many, well over 300 titles. And I think you will find some that will be directly relevant and helpful to you. Okay, so we've talked about the microaggressions as they apply to adoptees, but I appreciated in your work that microaggressions apply to all members of the adoption kinship network. But yes, adoptees, but also adoptive parents, adoptive grandparents, adoptive siblings, first parents, first grandparents, across the board. Let's talk about some of the microaggressions against birth parents, because you talk about stigma. I do think that there are such stigmas in our culture against people who've placed children. So what did you find out in your research?
Yes. So we're really excited by this research because no one's really talked to birth parents very often, other than Karen March did so in the 90s. And but there hasn't been a lot of research with birth parents themselves, and especially birth parents of color. So, in fact, when we were doing the adult adoptees, I had identified initially in my paper, I think 13 microaggressions. And we added a couple more from doing the coding of the interviews. But once we started doing the birth parents, we've added quite a few because their perspectives are not only undervoiced, but often just not recognized.
Yeah.
Like, for example, secrecy and lies in adoption really, of course, fits microfictions, but also is something that a lot of birth parents have really felt, that they were a secret. They had to keep secrets. People often told mistruths about them, that their intentionalities for relinquishing, even the idea that they felt sometimes that they didn't have a fully voluntary relinquishment, but more coercion. But the lie is that they gave them up, which is, and I'll put that in quotes as well. But so some of the microaggressions, the one that's probably one of the most common is the shameful, inadequate birth parent, which really promotes the judgment that our society has against birth parents, because by relinquishing a child, it's unrelatable to a lot of people. And so they judge character of people who've been in that position, not recognizing that there are many systemic and institutional issues that are at play here. And it's not really necessarily about the choices that a birth parent had. They may not have felt they had very many choices, not the same number of choices that a resourced person with a lot of support would have. Another one is the sacrificial birth parent. So a lot of times people look at birth parents and say, what a wonderful thing you did. Thank you so much. You're an angel.
You love them so much. Yes.
Yes. And that sends a message that, of course, that they did the right thing, that they shouldn't have been parenting. They did a better thing by saying, you're not really, I wasn't capable. I shouldn't have been in that position. And I did a good thing by, in some ways, ripping apart my family.
So any other standouts from the birth parents, microaggressions, before we move on?
There are, but we haven't published them yet. We're about to write that up. So I'm gonna
exciting.
Yes, that'll be coming out hopefully. We're in the final stages of finishing up some coding. But I can say that there's things like a relinquishment taboo that some birth parents have talked about, that they recognize the microaggression they're experiencing is that relinquishment is not even something people should consider. And again, that sort of leads to more feelings of shame and being ostracized. And a lot of birth parents never tell anybody that they were birth parents because of that shame and that taboo. So they may have one or two people, maybe a sibling or their own parents, that may know, but otherwise they are silent in the community.
That was actually, I don't know if it's still encouraged, but certainly back in the day, whenever that was, I think it was very much encouraged to
absolutely
get on with your life. Don't, because there was a shameful aspect, you were pregnant, you shouldn't have been pregnant, don't let the world know. So yeah, I think that, and even now, I suspect that even if that's not even the reality there, that continues, because it was so much a part of our societal norm.
Yes. And that sort of get on with your life message, I called phantom birth parent, that it's almost like people say, and a lot of times adoptive parents have said this about it, children adopted internationally. You'll never get to meet your birth parents. Thank goodness they're not going to come onto the scene. We don't really have to think about them. I'm your parent now. And so the birth parents kind of get erased, at least figuratively in the family, while emotionally they're not erased often for the adopted person, so they don't know where to put those messages.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to thank one of our longest partners who has been supporting the Creating a Family show for a very long time, and that is Hopscotch Adoptions. They are a Hague-accredited international adoption agency, placing children from, and I'm going to read out the list, Armenia, Bulgaria, Croatia, Georgia, Ghana, Guyana, Morocco, Pakistan, Serbia, and Ukraine. They specialize in children with special needs, including Down syndrome, and they also do a lot of international kinship adoptions. They can place children throughout the U.S., and they offer home study services and post-adoption services to residents of North Carolina and New York. All right, so we've talked about we used to call the triad, but so we've talked about adoptees, and we've talked about first parents, but we should also probably talk about adoptive parents. Are there microaggressions against adoptive parents?
Yes, 100%. I think one of them is the altruistic rescuer, a microaggression that says what wonderful things these adoptive parents have done. Some people go into adoption feeling like the reason they're doing it is to rescue a child, to say we can provide a home, and that is really insidious because it can also feed into the narrative that adoptees should be grateful that they were rescued from these terrible circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And it also feeds into the cultural philanthropy kind of message too, that rescuing means coming to the US into this wealthy family. There's been a sort of well-known, I think, YouTube family that adopted a child from China, a boy, and used that to really garner followers, and had a very much a rescue narrative. And then suddenly the child disappeared from their family, and there were questions, a lot of questions, because these people had at least in what a lot of people say, because I really wasn't a viewer of theirs.
I wasn't either, but apparently they used it very much to get followers, and followers equate to money on YouTube.
Yes,
so
exactly. And so then, but that rescue narrative was very much a function in that story. And adoptive parents are also experience a lot of the biology as best messages too, and a pseudo inadequate message about they're not real parents. They're sort of placeholders or temporary caregivers, but they're not as good as someone would be if they were biological to them.
Your feelings are not as intense, or your experience is not as, again, air quotes, real as somebody who birthed a child.
And they're not as, and their instincts aren't as good because they somehow didn't pass, because they didn't birth the child, they would not have real true instincts that would make or right decisions.
Yep. That's certainly one. Yes. There's also, I don't know if this is a myth. I don't know if this falls into microaggressions, but the idea that most adoptive parents were infertile, and it's the myth around or the stigma around infertility, and that you are less than, your body is a failure, and that adoption, this feeds into the adoption is second best narrative as well.
Yes.
So Is that a microaggression, would you think?
Oh yes. I would say that the one around, even calling an adoptive mother as using the word barren, of course, also sends that it's the biology is best message again, and the pseudo inadequate, that their infertility makes them also suspect, that we might not believe that they know what they're doing, or they're not resolved, or any of those things. Another microaggression I should mention too is commerce in adoption. So a lot of adoptive parents are kind of asked how much their children cost, and they have people might project that they're wealthy as a result of having adopted children, and because sometimes it's associated with celebrities now who've adopted children. Some people have likened it to being children adopted internationally as a prestige accessory.
Oh, kind of like the puppy in a handbag type of thing. Ooh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I guess that makes sense if you think about some of the high profile adoptions. And I mean, at least in theory, they tended to be international. And so at least in theory, there could have been an increase in adoptions as a result. Yeah, that's interesting and a
Exactly.
little depressing. Okay, so one question I have, you had mentioned at the beginning when you were talking about microaggressions that there is very often a lack of intention and certainly a lack of intention to hurt. Now, some of the ones we've mentioned here feel that there has to be a little bit of an intention just because it's, it feels that it would have to be. But some of what we've mentioned, I can see that there is no intent to hurt. Maybe it's just so baked into what we think. So does that change the aggression part because it's micro, or I guess micro is not the right word, because it's not intended? Does that in any way change the fact that it is an aggression, it is an insult, an invalidation, or whatever?
I mean, the micro part is it's an interesting perspective. I've had lots of students and peers and colleagues ask that too, that these things don't seem small, they seem big.
Uh, but some that you mentioned did, and some that you mentioned don't. Somebody asking you, complimenting you on your English, when obviously you speak perfect English, that seems more micro. Somebody calling you a name, or somebody demeaning your parenting because you didn't give birth. That type of thing seems more major. But some do seem micro.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it really does run the gamut. And
Uh-huh.
I think the bigger piece is that a lot of folks don't recognize these as part of the stigma and how it impacts people.
Yeah.
And so they might not see that this can become a legitimate challenge for an adoption stakeholder. So an adoptee who grew up with the messages of being grateful and being in the cultural limbo and all of these other things, their reactions to those microaggressions may have been invalidated and minimized. And so we may forget the impact that can have on their self-esteem, on their functionality in relationships, and even their relationship to their families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, being told that you need to be grateful, even subtly told that you need, the expectation of gratefulness is a huge burden to place, I mean, on any child.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the other ones that I wrote about was what I called adoption is a win-win. And one of the things that I was thinking about was at the time, and some folks still talk about this, the red thread theory that you've probably heard of, especially among Chinese adoptions, that the adoptee was meant to be with the family. And I understand the intentionality is to make that child feel wanted. It uses the sort of chosen child method to try and alleviate any grief that the child might have. And that's something that goes back for generations, that people have used that method to try and, but it also says that child was meant to be torn apart from their birth family, that they were never supposed to be raised in that family, that the birth parents were supposed to have to give up this child, and all these traumas were supposed to happen. So it kind of ignores that piece of it and emphasizes the positive. So, and it also says everybody wins here. The child needed a family, the adoptive parents needed a child, and the birth parents weren't supposed to be raising these kids for lots of reasons.
Mm-hmm. And even if there are certain parts of that is true, and that the parents are doing it because they want the child, they want to counteract the biology is, that microaggression, that biology is superior. So their attempt is to overcome that. But it seems to me that one of the challenges there is that you're sticking your kid into a box that may not fit them. They may fit them. When I interviewed a bunch of adoptees a long time ago, I was surprised at how it was certainly a couple out of my relatively small sample size talked about. There was a poem, and these were all women who were, women and men who were probably in their 30s at the time, and this was probably 15 years. Anyway, so it was a poem that went around talking about, you were born in my heart, or under my heart, right under my heart. There was I don't remember it now. And honestly, it never spoke to me. It always felt like a little, trite or whatever. But I was surprised at how many, from the adopted person standpoint, that they loved it. it really summarized. So again, that box may feel comfortable, but what if that box doesn't feel comfortable? What if the adoptee is really misses and really wants information they don't have, whatever the information would be, or is frustrated because they really are very dissimilar to their adoptive family and they feel odd man out type of thing. Anyway, it seems like that would be part of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I hear in what you're saying, Dawn, is that there are the adoptees who really cherish the chosen child kind of narrative and grew up seeing adoption largely as positive, and that goes for lots of adoptees. But the challenge there is that sometimes for some adoptees, they start to develop a more critical lens around adoption, and it's often referred to in the community as coming out of the fog.
And the opposite of that is drinking the Kool-Aid. If for those who have a more positive view, they're told they're drinking the Kool-Aid, and the ones who are are saying that we're coming out of the fog. So yeah, you're right.
Yeah, but what I think happens though, it kind of demonstrates the fact that adoptees are going to be pathologized no matter what they do. One way's good.
I know. It does feel a little. So, I mean, how do you, okay, this will be my last question. It does feel that we're a bit darned if we do, darned if we don't.
Yeah.
Cleaning it up for the podcast here. So how do we navigate wanting to be aware and wanting to be accepting of adoptive people, adoptive first parents and adoptive parents, being across the gambit, having all sorts of emotions? How do we do that? How do we walk this line, Dr. Baden?
Well, I would recommend to folks to watch Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk from, I think, 2009.
The
Danger of a Single Story.
Yes. Danger of a Single, I couldn't remember the name. As well as read her books, but go ahead.
Yes. I mean, I think that the real factor is that we paint everybody with the same brush. And as Chimamanda Adichie was saying, if you have a single story about who adoptees are, who adoptive parents are, then you're bound to misrepresent people. But if you can allow us to be as varied as you allow other people to be, then you might have a better chance of hitting the spot where it needs to be. So, like, for example, if a clinician who is maybe not trained in adoption, which unfortunately is way too common, they may assume, oh, okay, this person's adopted, all their problems are because they were adopted. And they may not be able to see the nuances and the challenges that may not be fully about adoption. So they may not address the aspects that are needed there. On the other hand, they may completely minimize or dismiss the impact of adoption. So it's, again, finding balance.
You couldn't have ended on a better note. I will link Danger of a Single Story in the show notes. Thank you so much, Dr. Amanda Baden, for being with us today. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I've had a blast. So thank you so much for being with us.